there are a lot of questions about how America 250, how this birthday is being celebrated. And I think one of the central pieces of that is just who is throwing the party.
Clearly, that does have an element of politics involved when it's the president and vice president sort of overseeing all of the various activities of that Freedom 250.
If they're asked, how is the U.S. doing 250 years in, you're going to get vastly different answers.
Hey guys, great to see you again. And it's a good time to come together to talk about what is a big milestone in America's history. It's 250th birthday celebrations.
Absolutely. There's a year-long set of events, really, aren't there? But it feels like it's coming into the peak now as we are approaching July 4th. And as you say, 250 years since the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia, of course. But a lot of the focus is naturally on Washington, D.C. and on the National Mall and, of course, on President Trump.
And so far, it's been a real spectacle. I have to say, President Trump, of course, comes from a background in which he has a lot of show business experience, being a TV host and all. And it's really been, I mean, at least purely from a visual perspective, really quite spectacular. Just, in the last week or so, seeing the B-2 bomber fly over downtown Washington, D.C. I kind of grew up here, and that's not something even remotely similar to anything I'd seen for any sort of national celebrations before.
And there are quite a few flyovers, aren't there? I mean, we saw some flyovers around that Freedom UFC 250 event at the White House. Then we had the kickoff to the National State Fair, Great American State Fair. And then, as we're told, the most spectacular of all flyovers and fireworks displays and everything will happen on July 4th itself. Even locking down the airport here in Washington, D.C., Reagan National Airport, for several hours before and around the event. And that's happened a few times. And I've heard from more than a few disgruntled travellers who've sort of discovered their flights have been cancelled or delayed in order to let these flybys happen, and then this big fireworks display that's going to happen on July 4th as well.
And that flyover on the 4th of July is also I believe President Trump said, the debut of his Qatari Air Force One, that I think very controversial, obviously, but I think people will be excited to see it. I also think the flyovers is kind of, it's sending a message from the White House. He always says America is back, peace through strength. And that's kind of a very military heavy display that so far we've seen for the 250 celebrations.
Oh, yeah, it's been front and center, hasn't it? That American military strength. And we should say, actually, that President Trump on the 3rd of July will be going to Mount Rushmore, to South Dakota, to witness some fireworks there. So as we're talking about America 250, and as you said, Katrina, it'll be held in different celebrations across the country. The president will be attending one of those as well, right before that big July 4th bash here in Washington. But of course, as is the case in many things we discuss in present day America, there are a lot of questions about how America 250, how this birthday is being celebrated. And I think one of the central pieces of that is just who is throwing the party. So there is the America 250 committee that was granted by Congress in 2016, and it's a bipartisan NGO that kind of set out to do things like restore landmarks and set out parties that would take place across the country. And then there's Freedom 250, which is what President Trump himself launched when he came back into office. And this is a public-private partnership. And this is what's been funding a lot of what President Trump has been rolling out to celebrate America's 250th birthday. And so you have these two kind of, I guess, in a way, competing organizations, although these aren't competing events, of course. They're all to celebrate the same anniversary. But that has raised questions about the politicized nature, perhaps, of how some of these events are being carried out.
And I think it's worth noting that event that kind of kicked off the main stretch of celebrations in which President Trump went down to the mall. I mean, that was a very political event. I mean, just listening to the tone and the language he used, it was, there was almost indistinguishable from a lot of the, rallies we saw during the campaign, from a lot of the public events when he's on the road speaking about the economy and generally the state of things. I mean, it was very, very, very similar. I think the difference was just the scale of it and the pageantry of it with the planes and everything.
I mean, he even had Lee Greenwood singing God Bless the USA, didn't he, before he came on stage. And I think that event in particular, that kickoff to this celebration of America, the Great American State Fair, became particularly political around, as you say, Sumi, those two organising bodies of these various events, because a number of the artists who originally said they would take part in all of these various concerts and festivities that are happening over 10 days or so thought that it was the America 250 organised event, as you say, through Congress, very non-partisan, organised by very many people from civic society, although there are a lot of past and present politicians from both parties involved as well. And then they said when they found out it was organised by Freedom 250 and that there was a political bent to it, that they pulled out, although Freedom 250 also says that it's a non-partisan organisation as well, and $150 million, I think, was set aside in the One Big Beautiful Bill last year for this Freedom 250. But ultimately, President Trump is the chair of it, and JD Vance is the vice chair of it. So clearly that does have an element of politics involved when it's the president and vice president sort of overseeing all of the various activities of that Freedom 250. But I don't know about you guys, a lot of the stuff that's coming into my inbox about all of the various events that are happening are coming from Freedom 250 organised events rather than the America 250 Commission. And the America 250 Commission is really also organising a lot of the smaller events that are happening right across America, because yes, we live here in Washington, D.C., we're right beside the mall, we see all the goings on, but this is a celebration of all America, isn't it? And it's happening in cities and towns right across the country. And it seems that if you look at the Commission and the events that they're organising, that there's a lot more of that kind of more localised celebrations, a lot more sort of museum curations as well, celebration of the history, the roles that various presidents and so on have played down through the years. And that seems to be still intact, even if it's not getting quite as much publicity on a national or international level as these Freedom 250 events are getting, and also by virtue of the fact the president's involved. So he talks about them a lot and he is there himself as well.
Yeah, and it is important to highlight that the states are, of course, each state has its own organizing committee, and is hosting a number of events. Los Angeles is hosting a huge party. The birthplace of democracy, as you said, Katrina, Philadelphia, will be hosting its own party as well. And so for the states, some of them have said they are not going to be as involved with the Freedom 250 State Fair, the Great American State Fair that is on the National Mall that President Trump kicked off. Some of them have pointed to, some of these states have pointed to the cost of being involved in it, but that doesn't mean that they're not holding celebrations on their own. And I think, it is the question to be asked, of course, is this going to be a politicized celebration of America's birthday? And you have plenty of critics in this country. President Trump would say it already is. Look at the fact that he did give that almost campaign rally style speech, and that a lot of President Trump's kind of pet projects like that UFC fight are the ones that are being couched in this larger American anniversary. But that being said, we do know that every part of the country is going to celebrate in its own way.
And I think that kind of speaks to the wider issue that, while I think almost all Americans are going to celebrate, I think depending on where they are in their political affiliation, and to some extent how they feel about President Trump, if they're asked, how is the U.S. doing 250 years in, you're going to get vastly different answers, depending on a lot of factors. And I think, everything is so polarized in the United States. I mean, I think it just kind of follows that the celebration of the 250 is also going to be polarized. And I think we've already started kind of to see that.
And what's kind of sad for me to note as a non-American watching this is instead of what you would imagine the whole country flocking to Washington, D.C. for July 4th to mark this, I've actually heard of vast numbers of people leaving Washington, D.C., that they don't want to be here and they don't want to be part of it on that weekend because they think it is so political. Others have said to me they think it is potentially the target for some sort of attack or assault. I mean, we saw that foiled plot, didn't we, around the UFC Freedom 250 event, where the FBI files show there were individuals who were prepared to use drones and snipers to try and carry out some sort of large-scale terror attack. So people have a real fear now of going to a big event on the Mall with the president involved. So that's, quite sad as well, isn't it? That people feel they can't mark such a milestone in their nation's history because of fear of attack or fear of being perceived to support or not support certain policies. And then also it's creating a difficulty for the international community here, for the diplomats, because ordinarily this is something that every country and every embassy would be hosting their own, America plus whatever nation celebration, celebrating the role that immigrants played in the building of the country and all of that. And they're having to chart a really fine line as well between what you're celebrating, who you're celebrating it with. Is it perceived to be a political event? And of course, commemorations and historical celebrations are fraught at the best of times because people have their own versions of history, and particularly when it comes to the birth of nations, it's very difficult and you have to walk on eggshells. I mean, in Ireland, when we were commemorating our centenary, we actually had a decade of commemorations because people couldn't really agree on what was the one little thing to mark or big thing to mark. So in order to be all inclusive to all communities, we had a lot of celebrations. But, I feel that this celebration, and particularly the focus on the Mall and July 4th and everything like that, is kind of detracting a bit from what people are setting out to mark, which is all the great history of this great nation.
I think to that point, it is also interesting to note that some of President Trump's critics have said, look, this vision of America at 250 that you are presenting is a sanitized version of America's history, not one that reflects the struggles and failures of the country in certain periods of time, slavery, for example, the civil rights movement, and the diversity of the country. When you talked about the various embassies celebrating their country's contributions to building this country, the word diversity and immigration, those are words you haven't found on the Freedom 250 celebration kind of literature and what's being focused on. That doesn't mean that, there isn't some, patriotic fervor on kind of all sides of the spectrum, I would say. But the question for me really is, what does a patriotism of the left look like? If they are opposed to President Trump's Freedom 250 project and say this is not an accurate depiction of the U.S., yes, you do have, as I mentioned, the different cities and states holding their own celebrations that might have a broader picture of what they see as the history of this country. But if there is the accusation that Democrats and the left wing of this country, whatever that encompasses for President Trump, is not patriotic enough, what does that patriotism look like for that part of the political spectrum?
And it's interesting because the White House is to a certain extent almost dismissive of that whole conversation, because they very much will take the view that the way it's being framed from the Oval Office and from President Trump is that this is a celebration of all Americans, full stop, and that they would argue that, kind of further distinguishing between Americans in celebrating the history is kind of discrimination in reverse in a way, kind of. But I think that's a great question about how those who are opposed to that view would argue that they're celebrating 250. Because obviously there's very, very different views of history, even, between this White House and the previous White House or the Obama White House, for example. I think they would be highlighting kind of slightly different things if they were in office today and during the 250.
And when I was watching the opening ceremony for President Barack Obama's presidential library, or campus as it is in Chicago, and you had all these really big name stars there, didn't you? Bruce Springsteen, Christina Aguilera, U2, all sorts of people were there. That's what we used to see for big events happening on the Mall. I mean, I remember over the years I've lived here, countless big concerts on the Mall with really big international stars like that. And because this has become so politicised, you don't have that this year, with the greatest of respect to Lee Greenwood. Of course, he's extremely famous in his own right, but you don't have those kind of chart-topping Billboard artists back to back for a huge, big free gig on the Mall in the way that you would, which also just speaks to how sort of polarized things are, but confused as well as to where the position of America is in celebrating where the country is at this moment in history. And it's a narrow lens in a way. People are looking at this year or these few years as opposed to looking across the whole spectrum of the 250 years and what America began as and where it is now. And it's just, it's leading to, it'll be interesting to see, and I'm sure we will be discussing the crowd size on the Mall on July 4th. And even President Trump, when he was addressing the crowd at the kickoff event this week, was like, oh, make sure you all come out for that event. That's going to be really spectacular, because we know how he feels about audiences, don't we? He'll want to see a huge number of people wedged into the Mall to watch the greatest fireworks display in history, as he says it will be. So we'll keep an eye out for that one for sure.
But like you said, I think just the fact that he called on people to go to that event will put off people who are detractors of his, or maybe people who aren't even, very politically active or engaged, because they don't want to be seen as going to something that they think might be perceived as kind of a MAGA rally of some kind. I mean, I just think if he narrowed down the scope of, potentially narrowed down the scope of people who might go to those sort of events by kind of involving himself publicly ahead of time.
What if it just invites a different crowd of people? So, for the number of people who will be leaving DC, perhaps, you'll have a huge crowd of people coming in from all parts of the country who are supporters of the president, who do, offer their own full-throated endorsement of this version of America's birthday, the Freedom 250 version, which is this kind of very muscular and military view of America's success and its power and its future, which, President Trump keeps saying is, we're better than we ever have been and will continue to get better. And just looking at some of the people who our correspondents have been speaking to, who were at the opening of the Great American State Fair, these were people who were coming from across the country to be with President Trump and to celebrate this birthday in that way. And I will say, I actually think that the state fair, a Great American State Fair, is the perfect way for Freedom 250 to be celebrating America. I mean, what's more quintessentially American than a big state fair where you have, random pieces of food like Twinkies and ice cream dunked in a deep
fried,
deep fryer,
yeah.
Which,
I
honestly,
yeah.
A Ferris wheel, like those are all things I can't necessarily enjoy, but a Ferris wheel, yes.
A Ferris wheel, yeah.
A Ferris wheel, yeah, but a deep fried Twinkie, not so much. But it does feel like that is a pretty smart and accurate kind of way to celebrate America 250.
I'll enjoy them on your behalf. Don't worry.
Yeah, you can have all our Twinkies, friend.
But I also think it's worth, about people leaving DC, it's worth mentioning, just for people who are unfamiliar, that DC, by and large, people who are registered to vote in DC are overwhelmingly not in favor of Trump to begin with, and they haven't been since the first term. So I think it's a bit unsurprising to me that they would leave.
Any Republican president. I mean, it's not just Trump. It's 96% Democrat or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of unsurprising, but I just wonder, how many will actually go through with that? Because at the end of the day, I think it will be kind of seen as a celebration. And, the White House is aware that these conversations are happening. And, one imagines there are people who think, let's just not politicize this as much as possible and, take a win that everyone will get behind.
I mean, there's lots of other events as well. Simi, you mentioned the Mount Rushmore event the night before. I mean, that's going to be, talking about TV spectacles, that's going to be incredible to see, President Trump against, and it's happening after dark, a backlit Mount Rushmore all the fireworks that will come from that. And then he's going to presumably get on a plane and fly back here to take part then in the July 4th stuff on the Mall the next day. And apart from the Great American State Fair, then a bit later you have the Patriot Games, which is a concept that I just find totally fascinating, which is this contest for 14 to 17-year-olds from across America. The application process is open now. You submit your athletic stats or whatnot, and then there's going to be these contests to ultimately narrow it down to one male and one female, the greatest athletes or high school athletes of all America. It has a tinge of the Hunger Games kind of again about it, doesn't it? Not that they're going to be killing each other, we hope not, of course, but that you have states competing against each other in this way with teenage kids sort of like who's the strongest and who's the fastest, or whatever. We haven't got the details of what the actual contests will be yet, but that's going to be quite dramatic as well.
I think in a way that's kind of like a domestic youth Olympics in a way. And, I think since a lot of Americans, I don't think that many Americans are super aware that that's going to take place. I think generally speaking, many Americans will think that that's quite a positive thing. It's youth sports, one of the things that's been less politicized in the United States for the last, decade or so.
And we can't forget, if we kind of look down the road a bit, there will be the big IndyCar race in August. That's will be taking place here in Washington, D.C. I went to a preview event for that. It's co-sponsored by Monument Sports. And that will be a really fascinating, really tight triangle corner of Washington, D.C. On a weekend. So obviously, closing down traffic during the weekdays would not be welcome to many Washingtonians. But it will be a really, interesting spectacle as well, because that will bring in crowds of IndyCar fans as well from around the country. And with that backdrop of the most stunning monuments of Washington, D.C. kind of along the path, will be one to watch. But all of this, of course, as we're heading towards midterm elections this year, will inevitably raise the question, where is America's democracy after 250 years? Where is, America's unity and solidarity, and where does America generally stand? And I find it fascinating to see all of these documentaries, if you turn on the TV these days, and kind of these reflections on America's past and its history, on some of the great American voices, and just how conflicted that view is. And as you said, Katrina, history is always conflicted. It's really who is telling that history and who is receiving it, of course, and how it's perceived. But it does feel like a particularly sharp moment to be having that reflection on this country.
And I think we saw a little bit of that in that sort of kickoff address that President Trump gave earlier this week. Bernard, you were saying it was like a campaign rally, a shortened version of it, because he was talking about that exact point of, US strength abroad and the US military. And he was talking about, obviously, the current operation in Iran, which then led into these comments about, very political comments about, who didn't want him to go and what they were doing and what he said would happen, and so on and so on. So it's sort of hard, I think, in a way, to celebrate the US military and not reference, a war essentially that they're involved in at this point. So it just makes walking that line for anyone, no matter who you are, quite difficult in terms of how to commemorate things and celebrate things without offending people who possibly don't like what you want to say anyway.
It's certainly a difficult needle to thread. But for example, last year during Trump's birthday, when they did the Army 250 parade, obviously he was speaking about different battles that the U.S. Army's been in, but it wasn't overtly political in any way. It didn't come off that way. That was a huge concern of a lot of people going into it, and they avoided that. It'll be interesting to see if they can kind of replicate, that avoidance of politicizing the celebrations.
And that celebration came just after the 12-day war in Iran as well, hadn't it? When the obliteration had happened of the Iranian nuclear materials that we keep hearing President Trump referenced time and again.
And, I think there's also a very specific reason the B-2 bombers are leading kind of a lot of these flyovers so far. Because that has now become synonymous with Midnight Hammer.
Well, we will certainly all be watching the celebrations closely, America's 250, but I guess we can talk about it on the other side of the big July 4th bash.
Yeah, lots to watch and talk about and digest anyway. So I will see you guys then.
Bye, guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.